The following is a recording of Quo Primum about the permanence of the traditional Latin Mass. Stay tuned at the end of the reading of the encyclical for an explanation by Father Hesse as to why this papal bull is still binding and why no one has the right to take away the traditional Latin Mass. Quo Primum, promulgating the Tridentine Liturgy, Pope Pius V, 1570. Apostolic Constitution. From the very first, upon our elevation to the chief apostleship, we gladly turned our mind and energies and directed all our thoughts to those matters which concern the preservation of a pure liturgy, and we strove with God's help, by every means in our power, to accomplish this purpose. For besides other decrees of the Sacred Council of Trent, there were stipulations for us to revise and re-edit the sacred books, the Catechism, the Missal, and the Breviary. With the Catechism published for the instruction of the faithful by God's help, and the Breviary thoroughly revised for the worthy praise of God, in order that the Missal and Breviary may be in perfect harmony as fitting and proper, for it's most becoming that there be in the Church only one appropriate manner of reciting the Psalms, and only one rite for the celebration of Mass. We deemed it necessary to give our immediate attention to what still remained to be done, namely, the re-editing of the Missal as soon as possible. Hence we decided to entrust this work to learned men of our selection. They very carefully collated all their work with the ancient codices of our Vatican Library, and with reliable preserved or amended codices from elsewhere. Besides this, these men consulted the works of ancient and approved authors concerning the same sacred rites, and thus they have restored the Missal itself to the original form and rite of the Holy Fathers. When this work had been gone over numerous times and further amended after serious study and reflection, we commanded that the finished product be printed and published as soon as possible, so that all might enjoy the fruits of this labor, and thus priests would know which prayers to use and which rites and ceremonies they were required to observe from now on in the celebration of Masses. Let all everywhere adopt and observe what has been handed down by the Holy Roman Church, the mother and teacher of the other churches, and let Masses not be sung or read according to any other formula than that of this Missal published by us. This ordinance applies henceforth now and forever, throughout all the provinces of the Christian world, to all patriarchs, cathedral churches, collegiate and parish churches, be they secular or religious, both of men and of women, even of military orders, and of churches or chapels without a specific congregation, in which conventual masses are sung aloud in choir or read privately in accord with the rites and customs of the Roman Church. This Missal is to be used by all churches, even by those which in their authorization are made exempt, whether by apostolic indult, custom, or privilege, or even if by oath or official confirmation of the Holy See, or have their rights and faculties guaranteed to them by any other manner whatsoever. This new rite alone is to be used unless approval of the practice of saying Mass differently was given at the very time of the institution and confirmation of the Church by Apostolic See, at least 200 years ago, or unless there has prevailed a custom of a similar kind, which has been continuously followed for a period of not less than 200 years, in which most cases we in no wise rescind their above-mentioned prerogative or custom. However, if this missal which we have seen fit to publish be more agreeable to these latter, we grant them permission to celebrate Mass according to its rite, provided they have the consent of their bishop or prelate or of their whole chapter, everything else to the contrary notwithstanding. All other of the churches referred to above, however, are hereby denied the use of other missals, which are to be discontinued entirely and absolutely, whereas by this present constitution, which will be valid henceforth, now and forever, we order and enjoin that nothing must be added to our recently published missal, nothing omitted from it, nor anything whatsoever be changed within it under the penalty of our displeasure. We specifically command each and every patriarch, administrator, and all other persons, or whatever ecclesiastical dignity they may be they even cardinals of the Holy Roman Church, or possessed of any other rank or preeminence, and we order them in virtue of holy obedience to chant or to read the Mass according to the new rite and manner and norm herewith laid down by us, and hereafter to discontinue and completely discard all other rubrics and rites of other missals, however ancient, which they have customarily followed, and they must not, in celebrating Mass, presume to introduce any ceremonies or recite any prayers other than those contained in this missal. Furthermore, by this present law, in virtue of our apostolic authority, we grant and concede in perpetuity that for the chanting or reading of the Mass in any church whatsoever, this missal is hereafter to be followed absolutely, without any scruple of conscience or fear of incurring any penalty, judgment, or censure, and may freely and lawfully be used. Nor are superiors, administrators, canons, chaplains, and other secular priests or religious, of whatever title designated, obliged to celebrate the Mass otherwise than as enjoined by us. We likewise declare and ordain that no one whosoever is forced or coerced to alter this missal, and that this present document cannot be revoked or modified, but remain always valid and retain its full force notwithstanding the previous constitutions and decrees of the Holy See, as well as any general or special constitutions or edicts of provincial or synodal councils, and notwithstanding the practice and custom of the aforesaid churches, established by long and immemorial prescription, except, however, if more than 200 years standing. It is our will, therefore, and by the same authority, we decree that after we publish this constitution and the edition of the missal, the priests of the Roman Curia are, after 30 days, obliged to chant or read the Mass according to it. All others south of the Alps after 3 months, and those beyond the Alps either within 6 months or whenever the missal is available for sale. Wherefore, in order that the missal be preserved incorrupt throughout the whole world and kept free of flaws and errors, the penalty for non-observance for printers, whether immediately or immediately subject to our dominion, and that of the Holy Roman Church, will be the forfeiting of their books and a fine of 100 gold ducats, payable ipso facto to the apostolic treasury. Further, as for those located in other parts of the world, the penalty is excommunication lete sententiae, and such other penalties as may in our judgment be imposed. And we decree by this law that they must not dare or presume either to print or to publish or to sell, or in any way to accept books of this nature without our approval and consent, or without the express consent of the apostolic commissaries of those places, who will be appointed by us. Said printer must receive a standard missal and agree faithfully with it, and in no wise vary from the Roman missal of the large type, secundum magnum impressionem. Accordingly, since it would be difficult for this present pronouncement to be sent to all parts of the Christian world and simultaneously come to light everywhere, we direct that it be as usual posted and published at the doors of the Basilica of the Prince of the Apostles, also at the Apostolic Chancery, and on the street of Campo Flora. Furthermore, we direct that printed copies of this same edict, signed by a notary public and made official by an ecclesiastical dignitary, possess the same indubitable validity everywhere and in every nation, as if our manuscript were shown there. Therefore, no one whosoever is permitted to alter this notice of our permission, statute, ordinance, command, precept, grant, indult, declaration, will, decree, and prohibition. Would anyone, however, presume to commit such an act, he should know that he will incur the wrath of Almighty God and of the blessed apostles Peter and Paul. Given at St. Peter's in the year of the Lord's incarnation, 1570, on the 14th of July of the 5th year of our pontificate. Hey all, as was said at the beginning of the recording, we're now going to check out what Father Hesse, Gregory Hesse, had to say about Quo Primum. For a little background, Father Gregory Hesse is one of the old war dogs in traditional Catholicism, and he was eminently qualified and highly trained in canon law, theology, and so forth. You can check out a lot of his talks. He died about 20 years ago. Anyway, he has wonderful talks, and his arguments are usually pretty airtight, and he's kind of encyclopedic with his knowledge. So we're going to check out what Father Hesse had to say about Quo Primum, and we'll just watch that together. This is an excerpt from one of his talks. It's about 9 minutes long. Thank you to the person on YouTube who actually cut this clip. So my gratitude and debt to them for doing so.
The Fathers of Trent therefore said that the Pope could not change the rites. Is that my interpretation or is it papal teaching? It is implicit papal teaching because have you ever held a Roman Missal in your hands? Well, if you get a chance, look up the first decrees at the beginning of the book. At the beginning of the Roman Missal, you will find the decree Quo Primum by Pius V. And as the only exception in church history, you will not only find Pius V's decree, but you will find 3 other decrees. All through church history, no pope published a book without cancelling his predecessor's document if there was one. The typical way, for example, of publishing the Code of Canon Law or the Corpus Juris Canonici that was the predecessor before 1916 would be to authorize a new edition and put in one's document, like Pope Urban IX would put in his name and throw out his predecessor's decree. The Roman Missal, since 1570, is the only exception in church history. Why? Because Pius V did nothing else but respect the Council of Trent when he codified what was there. When Pius V, Saint Pius V, in 1570 published the Roman Missal, he did not change anything. He changed a few little rubrics that were kind of, how do you say, they were not clear. They were kind of confusing, and so he changed them. But the book as such was the missal that had been used for centuries by the Roman Curia. And he canonized it with the decree Quo Primum, in which he says, not only the book must never be changed in the future, this Mass must be said by all priests in the future, but the decree as such is irreformable. Some people now argue that the Pope cannot bind the Pope. They argue in what you call legalistic nonsense. They quote Roman law and they misquote Roman law because they quote Roman law well, but they quote Roman law on a wrong level by quoting the old line, par in parem potestatem non habet. An equal has no power over an equal. The Pope at first sight may seem another pope's equal. But then, how about the dogma of the Immaculate Conception? Can a future pope take that back? No, you know very well he can't. So that means that the popes have to respect their predecessors. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly what the old oath of incoronation says. Don't be mistaken by the fact that the oath of incoronation was signed in writing by the popes only between the year 781 and 1302. But the text of the oath of incoronation is still today to be found in that singular collection of rights that pertain only to the Pope called Liber Diurnus Romanorum Pontificum. The text is still there. No Pope has ever contradicted that text. We are talking about basically 1500 years approved theology. That means it's the faith of the Church that the Pope cannot change things. And there, in the oath of incoronation, it says, if I was to betray the handed-down tradition of my predecessors, God shall not be a merciful judge to me at the last judgment. So tradition binds the Pope, especially in liturgy. Why? The oldest liturgical principle that has been written down the first time in the year 250, exactly 1750 years ago, is Lex orandi statuat legem credendi. The law of what has to be prayed will determine the law of what has to be believed. Do not confuse the law of what has to be believed with the deposit of faith. The deposit of faith is at the very beginning of everything. But the law of what has to be prayed, that is the Roman Missal, for example, will determine the law of what has to be believed. What is the law of what has to be believed? The Creed, for example. Every time you recite the Creed at Sunday Mass, at the same time you recite what you have to believe in order to remain a Catholic. Now, in the liturgy, you always found the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. You talk about Lex orandi, the law of what has to be prayed. In an ancient missal of the 14th century, or in a handwritten missal of the 8th century, you will find the Feast of the Immaculate Conception on December 8th. That's the law of what has to be prayed, because the priests had to celebrate that feast. However, it only became the law of what has to be believed in 1854, when Pope Pius IX proclaimed the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. So you can easily see in history that the law of what has to be prayed will determine the law of what has to be believed. Lex orandi statuat legem credendi. Until Pope Pius XI included, no pope ever misquoted that line. So for uninterrupted 1600-something years, we had the popes quoting the same line in the same way, always saying the same thing. Then Pius XII in 1947 turned this line around, which I don't think he had the right to do. It's a theological mistake, but it's not our topic today to talk about Pius XII. You can see from this principle that the Roman Missal cannot be considered a mere disciplinary law. It is much more than that. It is way above any discipline. The Roman Missal is the #1 law of what has to be prayed, because Holy Mass is the #1 prayer. Therefore, when Pius V said this Missal cannot be changed, and this decree confirming that is irreformable, he did in fact bind his successors. I ask you, is this my interpretation or is it the Pope's? Well, I showed you that is the papal interpretation, because even John the 23rd did not dare to take out Quo Primum or the decree followed by Clement VIII or the decree by Urban VIII. He did not dare to replace these documents. That means even John the 23rd visibly thought that he was bound by his predecessors' decrees. That makes 400 years of popes being bound, who felt, quote unquote, that they were bound. Of course, the popes didn't just have a feeling about it. Leave the feelings in California. In the Vatican, you have theologians to discuss things like that. Every single pope, before he writes a decree, will ask his cardinals and his theologians on how to write it. Very few popes ever were proud enough to think that they could single-handed write decrees. And That shows you why the new rite, which Paul VI himself called Novus Ordo Misse, the new order of Mass, is not a work of the Church. And it cannot be considered the Latin Roman Rite because the Latin Roman Rite is bound in the old Roman Missal. So what do you call it? Well, I call it a schismatical new rite. Why? Why? What does schism mean? Literally, in Greek, schisma means to cut, a cut somewhere. Schism, to go into schism means you cut yourself off the Church. You do not split the Church, as John Paul II says, or wants you to believe. You cut yourself off the Church. You cut yourself off from the Church. You leave the Church, in short. A schismatic act is not necessarily a formal schismatic act by declaration, so that you're really to be considered a schismatic, but it is something that cuts off something of the Church. Now, against Church tradition and against the Council of Trent, against Quo Primum, and against the interpretation of 400 years of papacy, Paul VI wrote up a new rite. Therefore, that has to be considered a schismatic rite.
So there you have it. There's Father Hesse's explanation. Thank you for tuning in. And as always, God bless you all. And if you do want to support the project of getting more of these encyclicals out there, you can click the links underneath either to subscribe to the Substack, which does help me, or you can just do a one-time donation if that's your thing. And if you don't want to do any of that, please just pray for me that I can continue this work. God bless you all and have a wonderful Lent. I'm sure I'll see you throughout that, but if I don't, have a great time. Bye-bye.